Et bonjour, c'est Fred pour IND100 Podcast. On est aux Imaginales et on est le samedi 24 mai, fichtre, comme le temps passe vite, on est encore frais, tout va bien. Et comme vous pouvez le voir, je ne suis pas tout seul. Donc je vais laisser parler le président et notre invité d'honneur quand même.
Bonjour à tous, merci Fred de nous accompagner sur cette interview. Donc moi je suis Guillaume, président de l'association muscatonique. Aujourd'hui on est très honoré et ravi d'accueillir John Langan pour en direct. Yes, you. Qui a écrit un livre, le livre, The Lovecraftian Book of the Year, The Fisherman, for us. So, on est très heureux de l'interviewer.
Oui, donc comme on disait, donc on est avec John Langan, l'auteur de The Fisherman, qui est paru chez J'ai lu. Et ça va être l'occasion de faire plus ample connaissance et de voir un petit peu. Donc toute l'interview va être faite en anglais, puis vous verrez les sous-titres par la grâce du président qui arriveront le long de la vidéo.
So today you are in Épinal in France. What's the first feeling you have today when you think about the fisherman?
That's a good question. When I think about the fisherman, I think of something. Actually, it's the first feeling today, but it's something I've been thinking about during this most recent trip to France, which is I never thought that the book would take me this far, if you will. And it's interesting. I thought to myself, you know, when you publish a book, you hope that it will not go out of print right away, but you don't. Beyond that, you don't know how long it's going to last, how long people will be reading it. I have seen enough writers who've written books that lasted a couple of years, you know, as it were in print for a couple of years, and then they disappeared. And every now and again, I'll think, well, whatever happened to this person or that person? And you know, you can find their books maybe on the used market, but they've just disappeared. And so I feel incredibly fortunate and incredibly lucky, also as if I've somehow pulled a trick somehow in being able to write a book that will be 10 years old next year.
And now you talked about Lovecraft with Fleur a few hours earlier, but how did you discover word fiction? Was there a book or a moment that really pulled you in?
Well, the immediate answer is that when I was in my first year in secondary school, I read Stephen King's novel Christine. I had read Cujo the previous summer, and it didn't really make much of an impression on me. But when I read Christine, that was it. That was the moment that I had my conversion experience. Saul on the road to Damascus. I suddenly thought, this is what I have to do. Having said that, I recognized that there were things in my life before that, things I had read before that I had loved, that had, in a sense, prepared me for that moment to read, or of reading Christine and thinking, this is it. So a lot of comic books when I was a kid. And those comic books, mostly Marvel comic books, so Spider-Man. I was a big Spider-Man fan, but also Conan the Barbarian. And Conan, the Conan comic led me to the Conan stories and novels, and which also led me to some of Robert E. Howard's other fiction, his weird fiction. So there were things, there's a story, I think it's called The Horror from the Mound, about a guy in Texas, and he's out digging up this mysterious mound in his backyard because he thinks he's going to find treasure. But what he finds there is not treasure. It's very terrible. And I vividly remember how frightening that story was. It was in a little collection called Wolf's Head and Other Stories. And it was all of Howard's kind of weirder fiction. Not all of, but a lot of Howard's weirder fiction. And so I think about the impression that made on me. And I think, that kind of made me receptive, I suppose, to what I would get from King.
And about the Fisherman, what was your first idea, image that gave you the inspiration for writing this tremendous story?
It was in a sense, it was more of a concept. When I started to publish fiction, I was very anxious about running out of ideas and about not being able to, about disappearing. And so I came up with all these strategies to ensure that I would be able to continue writing. And one of them was I had this idea that I would write stories that were in some sense reactions to or responses to works of classic American literature. And Moby Dick is one of my favorite books, and I thought, oh, I'll write a response to Moby Dick. And that seemed a kind of a cool enough idea for me to write a story or to begin to write a story about. The book then became, especially once I got into the middle section of the book, in a way it became just image after image after image. And I was really helped in a lot of ways by a piece of advice that the writer Jeffrey Ford gave to my friend Laird Barron. And Laird was writing his first novel, and Ford told him, when you're writing your first novel, your impetus as a writer, your tendency will be to play it safe, because you'll think, oh my God, it's my first novel. I don't want to, that was Ford right there. I don't want to scare off my audience, you know. And Ford said to Laird, fight that impulse, go nuts, go just over the top. So although I had written a novel before The Fisherman, when I was writing The Fisherman, when I came to the central section of The Fisherman, I gave myself permission to go nuts, as Ford would say, to just be expansive, to open things up. And I feel that really worked to my advantage and to the book's advantage.
About word fiction that you wrote, do you prefer novels or novellas?
In some ways, I wish that I could write very, very short stories, because if I could write very, very short stories, I could write more of them and be perhaps a bit more prolific than I am. But everything that I write seems to head in the direction of long, the novella or the novel. And so I have just accepted that that's my fate. I think for me, when I started writing seriously weird and horror fiction, I didn't want to write short stories, because so many short stories seem to me, I call them trap stories. The narrator makes a terrible decision and the monster gets them. And there were some brilliant trap stories. Edgar Allan Poe, you know, the Cask of Amontillado, say. But I'm not Edgar Allan Poe. And so I thought the way around this was to write longer stories in which you developed an emotional attachment to the characters, so that when the terrible things happened, then you would feel, oh no, I can't, you know. But also, in some trap stories, the terrible thing that happens doesn't necessarily make sense. And so I think part of what I like about working at length is the ability to try to suggest that there is a kind of a sense, if you will, about what's happening.
So the story, The Fisherman, has a lot of layers with stories inside stories. What was that your plan from the start? And did you ever think, why did that make this so complicated?
All the time. It's funny, you know, my youngest son has just graduated from university, and he's graduated with a degree in studio composition, in writing music. And over the last couple of years, we've had a number of discussions about our love of complicated things, our love of complexity, and also how it just, you wish sometimes you could just write something, the simple pop song, as it were, and instead of these elaborate kinds of songs or stories. So I have accepted at this point, at the moment, that is just kind of who I am as a writer, that as I'm writing, more ideas, connections, complications suggest themselves to me, and I just think, well, I'm just going to trust these. There are, like, I still have it in mind that I would like to write a very straightforward, simple story, you know, a chase story or something like that, you know, no flashbacks, no nothing, just let's just go straight ahead. But I think that the way wired, as it were, just leads me in that direction. And it does mean that at a certain point in a longer story, I start to jot down notes to myself. Remember, remember this, remember that.
And still about the Fisherman, there's something in wet fiction that is very important. Okay, it's the characters, but the location is very important because of the tone, because of the atmosphere. And why do you choose the Catskills?
So I had learned about the reservoir that is at the center of the Fisherman when I was at university. I went to university not that far from the Catskills, and I'd heard about the reservoir. And there were, I think I possibly even mentioned this in the notes to the book, that there were legends that if you were in a boat and you floated over the reservoir on a clear day, you could look down and see the spire of the church rising up to which is nonsense, because the reservoir had to be completely clear of everything, even down to vegetation, because it was going to supply drinking water for New York City. But I think I'd always had it in my mind, that I would do something with that image and something with the reservoir. But when I started writing weird fiction in a serious way, right about when I hit 30, one of the things that came to the fore for me as a writer was an interest in writing about my place. And so we think about Lovecraft with Rhode Island and sort of New England in general, and Stephen King obviously also with New England. In fact, when I was a kid, the very first horror stories I wrote were set in Maine, because I thought, well, if you write horror stories, it has to be in Maine. So I wanted to do something with my place in the same way that those other writers had done things with their place. And so it was a convergence for me, I suppose, of having read Lovecraft and King. And on the other side, the littérature blanche side, Faulkner and Flannery are kind of writers, especially of the American South, who had written about their place. And so I knew that my place, the Catskills and the surrounding towns, there was a great deal of history there in terms of European settlement in the Americas. They're among the older settlements. And even in terms of Native American settlement, there have been native peoples there since the last glaciers retreated. So this was an area that was full of history and of layers of history. And as a writer, I thought if I could tap into that sense of things, it could add things to the narrative that would make the reader feel maybe a little bit more than they understood, even that the weird events were happening within this kind of medium that was echoing them or amplifying them in strange ways.
There is a connection between the layers of the Fisherman and the layers of the location.
Yes, I live in a place where it is possible to see relatively new houses, let's say, being built, but also to see houses that are made of fieldstone and were mortared together by the first Dutch colonists. So those things, and obviously there are all sorts of, let's say, just in terms of houses, all sorts of constructions in between. And so it's possible to see those different layers of history coexisting beside one another as you walk down the street. And so that was something that I sometimes as a writer you think, I know this is important. I'm not 100% sure why, but I know I should include this in what I'm writing because it will have an effect and have a good effect. And Quentin is here with my coffee. Oh, bless you.
Coffee.
Merci. No, Cimer Mac.
Yep. So let's talk about a little bit about Lovecraft, of course. Lovecraft's characters don't show a lot of emotion. But yours feel very human, especially when it comes to grief. Was it hard to find the right balance between horror and strong emotions?
Well, I actually am. I have a minority opinion when it comes to Lovecraft, because the knock on Lovecraft, as it were, the criticism of Lovecraft, is that he can't do character, and it's all just, ideas. But I think within a certain range, Lovecraft can do character, and that is, it tends to be men, and it tends to be older men who have younger proteges. So in the case of Charles Dexter Ward, say, you have a guy, and the same thing actually is kind of true, the same sort of structure follows in The Thing on the Doorstep. You have these men who are like, well, I just killed this guy. But it wasn't really him. It was something that had taken over him. And it's this fascinating, almost sort of paternal duty that some of Lovecraft's characters find themselves caught in, where they realize that this young man who seemed to be a sort of at least a friend, maybe even a protege, has become overtaken by something evil, such that he's no longer himself, or there may not be a self anymore, and this character then has a responsibility to destroy that body, to not allow their friend's body to be used in this horrible way. And I think that it's, as I say, it's a very maybe narrow range of human emotion, but I think within that range, I think some of Lovecraft's stuff can actually be quite moving. Having said that, I would agree, he's not known for his characters, and I think that it may be easier for me as an older white man to look at Lovecraft and go, oh yeah, I understand, killing your proteges to protect them. But I think that that for effective, as I would see it, horror fiction these days, you need characters who are more human, as it were, who have a broader emotional range, so that when whatever the weird event is happens to them, or they happen to it potentially, that there are these kind of additional layers of resonance. I want to say meaning, and I kind of think meaning, but I also think that there's that kind of je ne sais quoi about the character's response that helps to give the story a presence in the reader's mind after it's done.
And do you think that horror or weird fiction is a good way to talk about grief or loss, that kind of feeling that is gloomy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I on the one hand, I'm leery, I guess. I'm nervous about saying, oh, it's all a metaphor for grief, because the fear you have as a writer is then that becomes a way of people saying, oh, that's all he's doing. But having said that, yes, when you experience profound grief, it is too much. It is beyond your intellectual or emotional ability to absorb. Yeah, exactly. And I think of horror as often a fiction of excess. It's just it is too much, and the monsters are too much. The possibly the style is too much. When King writes it, I think I myself was one of the people who misunderstood that book. The principle of composition that something like it, or Straub's Floating Dragon are founded on, is this principle of excess, of let's just try to go to do too much, because a lot of what, say in the case of it, a lot of what children experience is too much. It's the world is just too much. And then as adults, quite often the world is too much if you're paying attention. And even if most of the time you're able to subdue that, nonetheless, when tragedy happens to you, it's too much. And so horror becomes this way of representing that experience of the world through these figures, these monsters, these situations that are extravagant, that are themselves beyond the bounds of what is would be included, say, in a realist novel. or story.
So another question about Lovecraft. I have to ask. You write that Rainer used books that gave off some kind of black light. So I've got to ask: is it the Necronomicon or a copy of it?
I cannot tell you that. Yeah, I cannot. For the safety, for your safety, for the safety of everybody watching this. No, I think one of the things that I love about Lovecraft is the invented library, and I love that he and Clark Ashton Smith and Robert E. Howard and Robert Bloch are all inventing books. You know, I think I want to say that when Howard first writes to Lovecraft, he thinks the Necronomicon is real, and he says, "Look, can you tell me about this book? I'd like to know." And Lovecraft says, "No, it's all made up." But yeah, I think that the forbidden text is this really, really fascinating aspect of weird fiction, and I think that weird fiction in general, and you know, the Gothic in general, has a very, very ambivalent relationship to knowledge. It is very anxious about knowledge. Knowledge can do great things for you, but it can do terrible things to you because you don't understand what you're doing, or because somebody is able to use it against you. And so that aspect of weird fiction I really love. I spent a lot of time at the university. At one point I was working on getting a doctorate, which I did not, but the academic sense of things I find very, very congenial. So yeah, I did try to add a few. I have actually, over a number of stories, added a few weird books to the canon. I think probably the best known book at this point was how do I explain this? It started out as a French book. A number of years ago, my wife and I were in Provence, and we had the Michelin guides, le Guide Vert. And somebody told us, oh, well, you know, there's a Guide Noir to all the kind of weird aspects of Provence. And I love this idea. And so when I got back to the States, I was telling Laird Barron about this. And Laird said, that's great. I'm going to use that in a story. And Laird and I do this all the time. So he wrote a story called Mysterium Tremendum, which has this book called Morteror Calignis, the Black Guide in Latin. And then I use the Black Guide in some of my stuff, and it's become a website in my stories where you can go onto it and find information, but then it crashes your computer. So yeah, I think that forbidden texts are very much part of weird fiction, and I have used the Necronomicon sometimes, but I didn't want to use it too much because I wanted to evoke the idea of the weird text, but without evoking the familiarity of the Necronomicon, so that you would feel, oh, here's a weird book, okay, but I don't know what this is.
So now let's talk about the Léviathan, politics, in America. Sorry. So, speaking of horror, yeah. That's a big topic. First, why do you think so many great weird writers come from America, like yourself, Poe, Bierce, Lovecraft, Skin, etc.? Is there something particular in America?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think that, you know, Poe and, you know, Poe. Oh man, okay, so I got to think about this a little bit because, you know. Poe is writing at a time when he's trying to be a professional writer, at a time when you can't do that in the United States, when economically it's just really not possible. And indeed, many of the writers who came after him, like Hawthorne and Melville, didn't make livings as professional writers. They had other jobs. But I think that, you know, Poe is writing a tremendous amount. I think that some of what he's doing, he doesn't even fully understand himself, as it were. And I don't mean, he's a very thoughtful writer, but I also think he's writing so fast quite often that his creativity sort of outstrips him. And I think that And there's also the legend of Poe, right? That is created by his first biographer, Griswold, who hates him. He picks the absolute worst person possible to write his biography, which is just amazing. In some ways, it's an amazing detail, but it creates this kind of myth of Poe. I think that, and I think that Poe exists in American culture. In this weird, he has this weird position in American culture. I think that he's disreputable. He writes about murder and insanity, and he was an alcoholic, and he married his cousin, and I think that for certain writers, that's appealing. It's appealing that he is. For me, there's a certain appeal to the thought that the first major figure in American literature is so disreputable, is such a disgrace. And I think that some writers respond to that. They respond to the kind of outre quality of Poe's vision. And I think that like a later writer such as Bierce is drawn to something, to some of the same sentiments as Poe. But I also think, some of the first Europeans to encounter America, right, are the Puritans, let's say. And the English Puritans find the wilderness terrifying. The devil is out there, and he's out to get you. And this shows up in various sorts of stories, And I think that anxiety that is maybe fundamental to the European foundation of America about the presence of these other people, the Native Americans with these other traditions, who are seen in this fundamentalist religious context as in some way, evil. I think all of that lingers within American culture in this profound kind of way. And I think at this moment in time, at this historical moment, I think the United States benefits. We have a generation of writers who came of age reading, say, Stephen King, and so he exists as this presence in the literature of the United States, and I think a lot of other countries too, that has also had an effect on things. And you would have to think, I suppose, a little bit about the pervasiveness of horror in film and video games and things like that. I don't play video games because I'm old, but my friends who play things like Silent Hill and Outlast and so on, and all sorts of other things, right? They're having these kind of horror experiences in video games. So I think that horror is really, it has become part of American culture, and I suspect a lot of the world's culture in ways that are almost invisible in a sense. We don't necessarily see them for what they are anymore because they're so omnipresent. Halloween in the United States is just gigantic. It's such a big holiday now, much bigger than it was when I was a kid. I mean, we still went trick-or-treating, but it was a much more kind of quiet and melancholy, in a sense, kind of event. Whereas now Halloween is second to Christmas in terms of excitement about it, which of course I'm pleased by. But it does seem to reflect a general cultural trend in the States towards a sort of embracing of horrific imagery. So many bands, not just, once upon a time it was, like real metal bands, were all about horror imagery, and that has just now pop singers embrace horror imagery and iconography too. So I think, it's really, the funny thing is, in all this, I don't feel I've really answered your question, but I've provided a lot of obfuscation so that it looks like I did.
So you were the Fisherman before the Trump years, right? Almost.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But now the Leviathan character feels very connected to recent American feelings. Did you notice that afterward? This guy trying to catch a big monster to bring back. It was better before, so we were trying to bring it back.
Yeah, oh dear. When I was when I was working on The Fisherman, especially the middle part, which deals with the construction of the Ashokan Reservoir in upstate New York, which was carried out principally by immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe and African Americans who'd come up from the American South. That was, those were just the facts. That was just what happened. But I was aware, with the direction that the United States was already headed in the later years of the Obama presidency, I was aware that just to record this thing, to acknowledge this thing, was in a sense a political statement, to acknowledge that immigrants, my parents are immigrants. Without my parents, there's no me, and there's no participation of my fiction in the American tradition. So I think at that point I was aware that we were heading in a dangerous direction, which was not unrelated to longer trends, especially post 9/11, but which was also kind of different, because post 9/11 was it was a response to a traumatic event, which has done lasting damage in some ways, I think, to the sort of American psyche, if you can talk about such a thing. But I also think that those kinds of traumas with time may be worked through. I think what you saw happening at the end of Obama's presidency, with the first Trump presidency, throughout Biden's presidency, and now Trump 2.0, the Terrifier, you see some really ugly things that are, I don't know if they probably have always been present in the American psyche, but they have been ramped up in this extreme kind of way. You can look at Lovecraft, and you can find racism and xenophobia in Lovecraft, and Howard, for that matter, in some ways even worse than Lovecraft. But the feeling in the States right now that for a significant percentage of the population, that those are things we no longer have to wrestle with. Those are no longer darker impulses in ourselves that we have to transcend, but those are things that we're supposed to embrace and say, yeah, that's right. Everybody goes to El Salvador. That is very distressing. That is very disturbing, and I think, as a human being, let alone a horror writer, it is distressing to see so many of your fellow citizens embracing this rampant cruelty and inhumanity. We all do bad things. We all know, nobody's perfect. But I think to delight in the bad things we do, and to delight in cruelty that strikes me as particularly evil and particularly vile. What Bruce Springsteen has been saying at his concerts in England about, my country is in the hands of, evil, stupid and treasonous men, or something like that, and women. That's absolutely true. That is absolutely true right now. And I hope that we will come out of it, but I also think that damage has been done. And coming out of it is not enough. A reckoning with what got us here in the first place is extremely important. And I think, I write what I write in a sense because I'm compelled to write it. I don't feel I have a choice. This is just my stuff. But at the same time, I'm distressed sometimes to recognize that the things I'm writing about or exploring in my fiction, have these sort of real world manifestations, and I think I probably rambled on enough. So
let's talk about something maybe lighter, hopefully. If the Fisherman was to become a movie, what music or songs would you be on the soundtrack?
Well, since I mentioned that my son is a musician, I feel I would have to ask him to do the music, because otherwise those would be awkward dinners after that, I think you would want to have a mix. There were aspects of the novel that seem as if kind of folk music, American folk music might be very appropriate to have on the soundtrack. At the same time, if you think about sort of ambient musicians, Lustmord, or someone like that, I think that could also be very, very interesting. Part of me would like to say John Carpenter. He scored all of his own movies. And part of me thinks, oh, what would Carpenter do? But, I think as long as it's not bland, I think any kind of soundtrack, from my perspective, can work. As long as it's not a sort of bland or orchestral, this is what we hear in every other in every other movie. I think sound design obviously is hugely important in a movie, and good sound design, a good use of music can really help to make a frightening film even more frightening.
Let's imagine if you were alone on the river over there, what would be the 3 books you would bring with you to read, to have a good time?
Well, it's a small enough river, so I imagine myself standing out in the middle of the river. Is this where you want me to be? The books that I've returned to again and again are things like Peter Straub's Ghost Story, and so reading Peter in this lovely place is itself a lovely thought. I think I would have to include Ghost Story. I think I would also include something more recent than Ghost Story, which is now going on 50 years old, which is crazy to think. I think I would probably pick. I'd probably pick a book by a writer named Nadia Balkin, who wrote a book called She Said Destroy, which is a collection of short stories, which I think is just a knockout collection, and it's taken Nadia. It came out 7 or 8 years ago, maybe, and it's taken her this long to put together a new collection of stories. So I think I would take that. I think the other book I would take is a very recent novel by Mariana Enriquez called Our Share of Night, which is it's just the best novel. I was fortunate enough to read an advanced copy and to give it a blurb. And I said, this is the novel to which all later novels will be compared. And as time goes on, I really believe that. I think it's just such an overwhelming accomplishment. And I don't read Spanish, so I've had to wait for Mariana's work to appear in English. And I hope that even more of it will. But I think those would be my 3 choices at this moment.
I've got another question about this location, about Épinal, because it's your first time here.
Yes.
And what are your thoughts on, not on Épinal, but on a book fair in general, in Europe, in France in particular?
I think this is marvelous. I was at Quai de Polar in Lyon a couple, whatever that. I guess it was the beginning of April, so it wasn't quite 2 months ago, but it feels like it was 3 or 4 months ago. And I have to say that the organization of both these festivals is fantastic. The fan presence is amazing. There were just wonderful people who are so kind and who stand in line and who talk to you and say, I read your book and I have a question about this, or what do you think about this writer or that writer? And it's there's these. I feel like these kinds of events, genre events, I guess you would say, there's something about that coming together with people who share your passion, and that feeling that you're all in the same boat, you're all in this together, that is just marvelous to be able to experience it and marvelous to be able to participate in. And I think that the layout here, especially with all the little tents and is just it creates a nice ambiance for what we're doing. We're lucky, I suppose, in that we have decent weather. It's not too hot. It's not too cold. It's not raining. For now, there are no monsters. Godzilla has not made an appearance yet. So, I would absolutely encourage. I would hope to come back here, and I would encourage everybody who Yeah, everybody who can make the trip here, I would say it's absolutely worth coming here and spending at least the day, but why not the weekend? Come on, what else are you going to do? You're in Europe, which by American standards has a lot of vacation time. So spend some of that vacation time in Épinal.
Thank you. So this is almost the end. I've got 2 more questions. Is there a question you wish someone would ask you, but no one ever does?
A weird question. It's not really that I can necessarily think of it. My daughter is fond of finding weird questions online, and every now and again she'll send them to me. So the most recent one was, if you were going to wash your brain, would you use hot water or cold water? And it's funny, right away I wrote back right away and said warm water. You know, why would I want to burn my brain, or why would I want to freeze it? I feel like warm, soapy water. That's what I would use on my brain. And so I think that those kinds of questions, you know, what's your favorite kind of shark, you know? Great white. Because you have to say great white because, anyway. No, I think that people ask, you know, both here and in the previous conversation that I had earlier today, people always ask interesting things, and I have a certain amount of faith, I guess, in interested people's ability to ask you interesting questions. You know, people who've paid attention to your work will always come up with something interesting, something that you haven't necessarily thought of before. And that's very exciting, being involved in conversations as opposed to me just sitting up here and saying, let me tell you guys how it is. I think that's much more exciting and much more interesting.
Oui, moi c'est, alors, we are about to conclude, and I wanted to thank your French editor, because he's here, and you can come, please. Yeah, up.
Okay, you want me to sit here? Okay.
Yeah. And it's because of that guy that we are lucky to talk with John.
You want me to speak in English? Okay. I'm just going to say, well, I'm lucky to have discovered your books. So thank you, John, and thank you guys for this interview. We're really lucky to be invited in Épinal, like you said, to be discovering for people your books, and for me to be discovering other authors. So I'm very lucky. And
Other authors?
well, you're not the only one, John.
Dare you?
You're the best one.
How
Is the
dare
best
you,
one.
sir?
But we've got lots of wonderful, great authors.
I should just get up and leave right now.
And
The road stuff.
and also thank you to the readers.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what we have to say. Yeah.
Other authors. Other authors. No, I agree that it is, and I actually really appreciate that reminder that it's all about the readers. I started doing this because I was a reader, because I loved to read and I wanted to participate in some sense in the, I don't know, the literary field or something like that. I wanted to be part of that, and to affect readers, to reach readers, to have enthusiastic readers. When all is said and done, you can ask for more. When I was in high school, secondary school, there were certain books that we used to pass around to each other. The Stranger, Camus was one of them. And we used to just say, you have to read this book, you have to read this. And the thought that somebody might pass my book to somebody else and say, you know, you really have to read this, that's very rewarding and a little overwhelming. How could I think that I would do anything that would provoke that response in people? So yeah, thanks, Quentin. That's good. That's a good thing to return to at the end.
Last question as a conclusion. What do you hope readers feel or remember after reading The Fisherman?
First off, that its writer was the most handsome that they had ever encountered. That indeed, that his image, his smiling image, stays in their brains. I hope that in a I'm going to say that I hope that they were entertained. I think about entertainment in the sense that the writer Michael Chabon used it a couple of years ago in an essay where he talked about entertainment and traced the roots of the word to a notion of entanglement. And that when you entertain or are entertained by a writer, you become entangled with the book, and to a certain extent, as the writer is entangled with the book. And so in a sense, I wouldn't say exactly that you become entangled with one another, but there is something that happens there. So I would hope that a reader of The Fisherman finds something in the book with which they remain entangled, with which I would hope that it entertains them in the short term, but in the long term, I hope that it remains with them in a way that, in a good way, in a way that they find rewarding. I would hope that if they're writers themselves, I would hope that they would take this as an invitation to join the conversation and see what they can do as well.
Okay, thanks a lot for accepting this invitation, and we are without words because we are so happy.
I still think I should have stormed out. Yeah, that would have been an interview. Wait till you get to the end. Watch the end. You know, you see those videos and like, watch all the way to the end. And I storm out and the camera tilts and they're like, no, you know, screaming, dogs barking in the background.
So in French, merci beaucoup.
Well, de rien, mais merci beaucoup aussi.
Et merci Guillaume pour cette possibilité. Et puis on se dit à une prochaine. Ciao, ciao.